I'm going to talk to you today about Stein's version of phenomenology. Stein, it's hard to know how much background I need to give because people know very different things about Stein, but what I can say briefly is she was a phenomenologist. She was an assistant to Husserl, an educationalist, a Christian philosopher, Carmelite nun, died in Auschwitz, is a canonized saint, patroness of Europe, and doctor of the Church in Spee. So her family background was that of a very large family. She was the 11th child, the baby, and her father died when she was very young. Her mother was a very able woman who managed the lumber yard that her father left behind for the family to live on very well. So it was a wealthy family. The house is still standing in Breslau and is a conference center with lots of photographs of Stein and all the family members. So it was a very close-knit family, very full of intellectual challenges and discussion, Jewish, maybe liberal, but her mother was all the same a very profoundly believing Jew who found it mighty difficult that she became a Catholic and that she then became a nun. That was nearly too much, and Stein found it very hard to tell her. So it was difficult, and her family, as she entered Carmel in 1933, also some of them would have thought that it was a problematic thing to do, allying herself with Christians who at that point became more and more en bloc, taken anti-Semitic. So an intellectually very stimulating environment and a young girl who was extraordinarily determined to do what she wanted to do. Her mother, who loved her very dearly, it was perfectly mutual, allowed her to choose for herself, and wanting to do philosophy was all right, even if it was a breadless subject. The mother was sufficiently well placed to be able to say to her that she would provide her with a stipend, and she did for a number of years. And it's only when Stein had converted that she thought she wouldn't put it on her mother to pay for her later career, because there was a conflict in the mother between her being Christian and accepting payment for her scientific career. So that's when Stein decided to pay for her own scientific work by working as a secondary school teacher. I shall talk to you about Stein's version of phenomenology as it relates to Husserl's primarily, partly because there are slight differences that really, to many people, serve as a kind of obstacle so that they don't get how Stein could possibly be a phenomenologist. I also want to give this version of a phenomenology such that you will understand it as a kind of a first part of an explanation of why she understands phenomenology to be compatible with a well-reflected metaphysics based on faith. Now, phenomenology for both Stein and Husserl is primarily a method, and that means not a system. That's really important to understand how there is room for different phenomenologists to work together on different topics. So if I nevertheless insist on talking about Stein's version of phenomenology, it is because the distinction she makes in particular between motivation and psychic causality so influences the results of her descriptions of experience and allows her to describe what we call socially constructed reality with an accuracy that you don't find in any of the other phenomenologists. It also, in particular, allows her to describe human experience, both individual and collective, and it, in consequence, allows her to get a clearer understanding of what psychology studies, what the humanities studies, and what the social sciences studies. So she contributes to the foundation of these sciences, the phenomenological foundation of these sciences, and that's really a very major achievement of hers. That is possible also because this distinction is embedded in a more systematically intersubjective phenomenology, such that socially constructed phenomena, as I said, are analysed in their dependence on both psychic and social causality. Now, Stein remains a phenomenologist all her life, but the works that are formative of her phenomenology as such, and which I'm dealing with specifically here, are from 1917 on the problem of empathy, and from 1922, contributions to the philosophical foundation of psychology and the humanities, for short translated into English simply as philosophy of psychology and the humanities. So I'm going to present to you three things. First, Stein's understanding of the phenomenological method. Then Husserl's understanding of Stein, because there was both a great affinity and a very highly specific type of tension that brought them apart. And then I will address the question of Stein's influence on the phenomenological movement through her editing of Ideas 2, Husserl's Ideas 2. And then finally the clarification of this influence that Stein has had on the phenomenological movement, which is not inconsiderable, despite the fact that she's not named, through her publication, the Beiträge, or the Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities. So, first, what does she understand by the phenomenological method? The goal of phenomenology is to clarify, she says, and thereby to find the ultimate basis for all knowledge. So, clarification, basis of all knowledge. That's from On the Problem of Empathy, Chapter 2, Section 1. So it's very much at the beginning of her doctoral dissertation. She understands phenomenology to make use of the phenomenological reduction, which to her encompasses all the other reductions. Sometimes people try and distinguish them very carefully, but to her it's a matter of gradation. What she says is the following: the phenomenological reduction excludes everything that's doubtful, of course, and what it leaves behind is, and I quote now, an infinite field of pure investigation. There remains the whole phenomenon of the world when its positing has been suspended. And these phenomena are the object of phenomenology. However, it's not sufficient merely to comprehend them individually and to explain what is implied in them, inquiring into the tendencies enclosed in the simple having of the phenomenon. Rather, we must press forward to their essence. Each phenomenon forms an exemplary basis for the consideration of essence. So, the phenomenological reduction reduces everything to something that can be investigated in its a priori structures, in its essential structures. She does not think that Husserl has a different understanding of reduced experience. And probably Husserl would not have thought either that Stein had a different understanding of phenomenology compared to himself. equally, but it possibly is more important, more thematized in Stein, understands constitutional and eidetic analysis to be complementary and equally indispensable. So phenomenology encompasses different types of analysis. On the one hand, analysis of essence, and on the other hand, analysis of how things are identified, how they come together for us, how they are constituted. So, whereas we in Reinach and Hedwig Konrad-Matthews may found pronounced emphasis on eidetic analysis, they're sometimes called eidetic phenomenologists. Husserl rejects Konrad-Matthews' eidetic description of reality in Zur Ontologie und Erscheinungslehre der realen Außenwelt from 1916 and Realontologie from 1923. Stein does not accept that rejection. So Hedwig Konrad-Matthews provides their maybe idiosyncratic, but nevertheless very, very interesting and also clearly phenomenological eidetic description of how reality. So what is implied in reality? What is the essence of reality? That's what she describes in particular in her Realontologie. And Stein, because she understands that to be part of Reinach's heritage, accepts that in contradistinction from Husserl. So what that means is that an eidetic phenomenological description of reality is possible. It's not impossible. Now, Husserl didn't think it was impossible either, but for some reason it's frequently thought that phenomenology is not concerned with reality. It's in fact wrong. But it has a specific attention to it. It is a phenomenological attention to the experience of reality. Stein also understands being to be the correlate of the act of judgment. So whether that's naive or whether it's reflected, that's a heritage she has from Reinach, also often overlooked. Konrad-Matthews has it as well. And in fact, Heidegger has it as a feature of Dasein in his Being and Time. Apart from this, Stein also mainstreams Scheler's understanding of value. So Husserl has reflections on value, but not at all to the same extent as Scheler does. Scheler has a clear phenomenological approach, but is not as scientifically systematic as Husserl and Stein. So the integration of Scheler's value phenomenology and the systematization of it, or the systematization of it, the rendering it more useful, clarifying it, is specific to Stein. What it means is that personality for her explains worldview, as it also does for Scheler, and the degree of acceptance of grace explains our experience of being and the meaning of being. I shall not here go into her phenomenology of grace. You will find other videos on that subject if you need to address it. Now, what this means is that Stein has an understanding of emotion that is richer and clearer than both Husserl and Scheler. To her, emotion is experienced such as encompassing two experiences. the value feeling, the feeling of the value itself, and then the emotion. And the two don't always coalesce, as we experience when we're not happy, for example, with our own emotion. Then we experience that we're valuing something, but we don't live up to it, so to speak. Our emotion doesn't quite reflect it. And that's because there is a component of psychic causality in our experiential life. It's not purely motivated. So it testifies to this composition of our experience as experienced as being caused to some extent, as well as motivated. So motivation for Stein is the performing of one act because of another, for the sake of the other, whereas causality or psychic causality is experiencing particular in tiredness or overexcitement or anywhere where our experience reflects life power, either the lack of it or the having of it. Now, it's clear also that the analysis of empathy allows for constitutional analysis of social construction as well as of the psychophysical individual, such that the how, the who, and the why of the socially constructed phenomenon can be mapped. How? The constituting subjects are linked in different ways in their intersubjective constitution through similarity, through transfer of life power, she calls that psychic contagion, through association, which relies on choice, can be associated with other people and therefore choose an experience that's commensurate with theirs, or through community, which relies on direct value response. So there is a gradation of ways in which we form communities, form a we. She also analyzes, of course, or this way of looking at phenomenology also allows us to see who constitutes what, that which we are experiencing, and in what ways. And why it's constituted, why it's identified, because the motivation behind the worldview that somebody is having is available to us as value response, in its value response, in its response to values. Now, that includes the constitution of the contribution of animals to intersubjective constitution. We don't experience ourselves to be completely alone when we're with an animal. So it clearly influences our understanding of the world, how the animal looks upon the world and looks at us, as well as God and angels for those who believe in them. So in this way, through Stein's attention to values and intersubjective constitution, Husserl's understanding of the life world is, in its structure, is actually preemptively clarified. Now, so Husserl's understanding of Stein. As Husserl reads Stein's dissertation on empathy as her supervisor, he discusses with himself, but declines eventually to publish it alongside with his own ideas in Jahrbuch für Philosophie und Phänomenologische Forschung, because he has the impression that it anticipates much from his manuscript ideas too. This is something Stein says in her Life in a Jewish Family. Interestingly, this declining, and it's quite typical of Stein actually, makes Stein not hurt, but jump at the opportunity to say, well, then I could maybe help you put in order those manuscripts. So she takes it as an invitation, and on that invitation, she actually, which Husserl with great enthusiasm accepts, she becomes his assistant, and she gets to work in particular on Ideas too, but she also edited a number of other of his works, such as Space and Thing and lectures on time consciousness. But the most important thing was this deal to prepare the manuscript that was published eventually by Marley Beamel in 1952. So, posthumously, Husserl declined to publish it, even after Stein had revised it, and the assistant that came after her also had revised it. It so happens that a new edition of this manuscript, which really had huge influence on the development of, in particular, intersubjective phenomenology since. A new edition is prepared by Dirk von Farah. It's not yet out. It is supposed to come out next year. And to replace in Husserliana the previous edition, which was Stein's, is Stein's. It contains, this new edition, instead of Stein's elaboration, the three-part sketches that Stein had at her disposal, and these three-part sketches are clearly written by Husserl, in contradistinction with Ideas too, which is quite heavily edited by Stein. In fact, it's completely put together by her like a patchwork. Now, research on this is only beginning, but it looks as if Stein imposed. So I've had the pleasure of seeing the part manuscripts that exists in a finalized text, but the indexes are not yet finished. It's very complex to see where the various parts go, but it's clear from the 3 volumes that it will be, that it's a much larger pile of manuscripts compared to the 1 volume that Ideas 2 in Stein's edition is. It looks as if she imposes an order on these part manuscripts of her own devising, which she thinks is Husserl's. Of course, Stein is not trying to do something else than what Husserl would have wanted out of these manuscripts, but she doesn't quite find in the manuscripts what she knows to be there from having followed his courses. So she applies this tripartite structure that she has found in nature, in his course on nature and spirit. Material nature on the one hand, the constitution of animal nature on the other hand, and then finally the constitution of the spiritual world. So, putting all the manuscripts in order so that they reflect that is Stein's work. So, the construction of the work, the structure of the work is Stein's. Now, her own budding distinction between psychic causality and motivation governs the distinction between the last 2. So, between animal nature and between animal nature and spiritual nature, or the spirit. However, in her Beiträge, or Philosophy of Psychology and Humanity, she will, after having taken her leave as Husserl's assistant, she will elaborate this understanding of psychic causality. As a contribution, she understands Husserl not to have already achieved in that work that she has now edited. Now, Husserl did not, during his lifetime, publish Ideas 2. He was not happy with Stein's revisions. He possibly could not recognize the work, which is not so strange when you look at the part manuscripts, which bears his clearly identifiable voice. Ideas 2 doesn't have one voice because there are 2 voices in it, and that's quite confusing to read. it's not a beautiful work. It's a composite work of two authors. So Husserl did not publish Ideas 2, but he did publish Stein's contribution to the philosophical foundation of psychology and humanities in the Jahrbuch für Philosophie und Phänomenologische Forschung, in contrast with On the Problem of Empathy, which Stein had published elsewhere. So he clearly understood the two treatises, that it contains psychic causality and individual and community, as original contributions to phenomenology. So he didn't understand himself to have already achieved what they put forward. As they elaborate the distinction between psychic causality and motivation, we can take it that his contribution to Ideas 2 did not, even if we find in the headings of Ideas 2 the notion of psychic causality, but these headings are by Stein. They're not his own. So, the structuring of Ideas 2 provided a kind of influence of Stein on the subsequent phenomenological movement, insofar as Ideas 2, in her edition, played a major role in intersubjective phenomenology going forward, after the war, basically, well, after the publication in 1952 of Ideas 2. This influence can best be captured, I think, by the impression Ideas 2 gives of being a grand-scale work, covering all the constitutional issues relating to everything in the world, nature, psyche, and spirit. Given that all the headings are introduced by Stein together with the structure, this impression is an impression of her thought rather than Husserl's. It's not, maybe not Husserl's, and this is where it's so difficult to distinguish, but he had the vision that he would like to accomplish this, but the manuscripts that's there are not accomplishing it. So there is a contradiction probably between what Stein expected the work to be and attempted to turn it into, and what in fact it achieved. So her vision was not either enough probably to gel together the materials that were there to actually yield what was supposed to be achieved. It has been widely believed after the publication of Ideas 2, despite Stein's editorship being known, that this grand-scale impression was Husserl's production, and thus that grand-scale scheme of things was allowed to influence subsequent development of phenomenology as if it was Husserl's, which it maybe was also, apart from also being Stein's. It's clear from Stein's subsequent work, however, that she thought this same presentation of the constitutional issues relating to the main ontological regions could not be achieved without a clear distinction between psychic causality and motivation, and that this distinction was not clearly present in Ideas 2, even after her edition of it. So you can see the distinction between motivation and psychic causality is central to Stein's contribution to phenomenology and what she thinks is necessary for us to gain an understanding of how phenomenology can found psychology, the humanities, and the social sciences. Husserl's work goes in an opposite direction compared to Stein after the editing of Ideas 2. He, in contrast with Stein, will not recognize a proper object for the science of psychology, separate from phenomenology, which we see, for example, in the crisis of the European sciences and transcendental phenomenology. He understands psychology and phenomenology to be ultimately the same. Stein doesn't. Psychology studies the psyche, which is identified by psychic causality forming an element of the constitution of the experience that is psychic. That allows Stein to say clearly that not all subjects are necessarily psychic. Animals are, and human beings are. But it's possible to imagine a subject that's purely motivated without being caused in its experience. And that's what we imagine pure spirits to be like, angels and God. So the two parts of philosophy of psychology and humanities, on the one hand psychic causality, on the other hand individual and community. Psychic causality deals with the constitution of the psyche from acts in which life power manifests itself, the psyche being the proper object studied by psychology, and individual and community deals with the differentiated constitution of community dependent on different means of sharing life power in mass, association, and community, which explains why the object of the humanities, motivatedness or spirit, incarnates in communal life in different ways. So, finally, the clarification of Stein's influence on the phenomenological movement through Beiträge. What Stein presents in Ideas 2, she's also critical of in Beiträge. So she edits Ideas 2, but she also is critical of it in her own work. She thinks that the understanding of intersubjectivity does not sufficiently present the intersubjectively constituted body. So Ideas 2 is not, according to her, sufficiently aware of how important culture is for our constitution, identification of our own body and bodies in general. The understanding of the soul is not sufficiently distinct from that of the psyche. The understanding of reason and of values is not sufficiently pluralist and is lacking in reflection on the possibility of holding different worldviews. So to her, the world is not a world of just reason regulating everything, but of people having different types of rationality, which can nevertheless be understood from their value response. But people are very different for Stein, whereas for Husserl, this difference in worldview doesn't come across as of interest to analyze. Then also distinction of psychic causality and motivation is not systematically carried through, so that a constitution of the psyche and of the spirit as distinct phenomena is not achieved. And finally, the idea of sedimentation as a placeholder for her distinction between psyche and spirit is something she doesn't know what to do with. She does not adopt it, and Husserl himself is developing it into what he calls genetic phenomenology, which in a sense takes the place of her social construction. So, Stein's version of phenomenology is thus characterized by having the concept of psychic causality and of life power isolating the indispensable contribution of the phenomena they represent to the constitution of the body. Consequently, it's also characterized by a consequently enabled constitutional analysis of human beings as psychophysical individuals as well as spiritual persons motivated by values. And it is also characterized by a consequent openness to our relationships and the formation of community being characterized by both spiritual and psychic aspects, corresponding to the different aspects of the human being. So there's a few other things that are consequences of our contributions to phenomenology which differentiates them from Husserl's. The body is one locus in relation to which empathy is experienced, but it is not, according to Stein, completely or necessarily a priori indispensable for it. Purely spiritual persons are also imaginable. Habits, whether personal or communal, are to Stein hybrid phenomena having a spiritual chosen dimension as well as a psychophysical life power channeling dimension. And sentient contagion, which is not a phenomenon Husserl works with at all, really, may condition value response and community formation without the personal acceptance of the people involved. So there is a large part of our experience that's not completely transparent to us and often needs a lot of digging and communal involvement to understand. Choice may also commit the psychophysical individual to something at odds with its spiritual commitment and thus estrange soul and spirit. Now, today it's actually sometimes claimed that Husserl and Stein's understanding of empathy and intersubjectivity are best understood to form one whole. They worked very, very closely together when Stein worked as Husserl's assistant. So to some extent that makes sense. It also dispenses us from having to distinguish which understanding of empathy is Husserl's and which is Stein's. It probably can't at this point be taken completely apart. That has some advantages, but it does overlook Stein's integration of value phenomenology, her distinction of motivation and psychic causality, her description of life power, and the consequent stratification and structure of intersubjectivity dependent on the type of we that is co-constituting it. These ideas and their corollary of social causality make Stein's version of phenomenology more directly useful for analysis in psychology, the humanities and the social sciences.
I'm delighted that the St. John's timeline has now found a new home. We are working with the Christian publisher Hymns A&M, and the new website hosts all the videos we have produced over the last 12 years, including plenty of new material. There is over 160 videos, 100 hours of quality content, which we are known for. There is a low annual subscription fee, and all the profits will be going to produce new videos. The link to stjohnstimeline.org is in the video description below.